So I'm Jane Stricker. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Senior Vice President at the Greater Houston Partnership and the Executive Director of what we call HEDI. And really what we're about is a recognition that we have two problems to solve. The world needs more energy for the long term, and we need to do it with less emissions. And our philosophy in Houston is every solution has a place to play. Fossil isn't part of the solution. We aren't about saying renewables isn't part of the solution. We need all of it, and we need more of all of it, and we need it to be as clean and low carbon as possible. And so our work is really about how do we leverage the industry leadership that's already here in Houston, that has been delivering energy to the world for decades, and bring that together with the innovation and the technology that is going to allow us to make that energy as clean and low carbon as possible in every way. And we need all of it, and we need more of all of it. And we are doing all of it here in Houston and in Texas. And that's what I love about this market is we're the leaders in wind. We're the leaders in solar. We're doing battery storage. We're developing nuclear. We're doing carbon capture. We're doing clean hydrogen. Everything has a role to play in getting us to a cleaner energy future. And so really thrilled to have Canary Media here and talking with some of the great startups and founders that are here in Houston, making a difference for the world and creating technologies and solutions that will allow us to have impact around the world and meet our energy and carbon goals. So with that, I'm gonna hand it back to Julian and let him get things started.
Thank you, thank you. Okay, let's bring up our first panel. We wanted to think about how to kind of like set the scene and really dig into the state of the clean energy market in Texas, and what better way than bringing a bunch of journalists to write about the energy transition in Texas and get them to kind of share their firsthand experience from telling these stories. Should I keep using this mic or use this one? This one? I'll keep doing that one. An abundance of mics. This is great. So yeah. Well, let's do the intros so you know who we're dealing with here. So first we got Claire Howe, who's with the Houston Chronicle, reporting on the grid and the energy transition. And right here is Doug Lewin, who writes the Texas Energy and Power newsletter, the Energy Capital podcast host, and really a go-to source for anything about the state of play in ERCOT and the legislature and the what's happening in Texas energy. So very pleased to be here. He came out from Austin, actually, to be with us tonight. So that leaves Naomi Kling, who's with the Houston Business Journal, reports on the energy industry. And yeah, we're really glad to have all of them. Let's do a round of applause for all of them. Great people. Yeah, it's maybe selfish. I just like being with other journalists on a stage. So let's get started by setting the scene of where the clean energy and industry and the energy transition stands in Texas coming into this year. We're right at the tail end of January. I think, maybe you all are aware of it, but elsewhere in the country, people don't necessarily realize just how central Texas is to American clean energy development and installation right now. I mean, biggest on large-scale solar construction, biggest on wind for a long time. Battery installations, this is the newest of the bunch, but now, depending on whose data set you look at, the biggest state for battery installations last year. So I was just wondering from your perspective, tell us about how big a deal clean energy has become in this state, and sort of from your work, what's a way that you're seeing that start to reshape the overall energy system here? Kind of a open-ended question just to kick it off.
Yeah, so I mean, Texas really is, it would be hard to overstate how much Texas is doing on clean energy. It really is the driver for renewable energy in the United States, and as Julian just mentioned with storage. Just to give a couple of stats, we are just about at 30,000 megawatts of solar. The peak on the grid is 85,000 megawatts, so really getting to a point where it is not uncommon. It's actually quite common to see 25 to 30% of the power during the day generated by solar. It's making a huge difference in the summertime. It's made such a big difference that, you know, I can remember not that long ago, like 2019, where I was having discussions with people on a daily basis in August, like, are we gonna make it? Is there gonna be outages at 4 o'clock? We had a couple energy emergencies. People didn't pay that much attention to it at the time because it was like pre-Winter Storm Uri, and like people didn't really think there'd be outages and weren't really like understanding what that would mean if there was. After Uri, everything's quite different. But there were a couple energy emergencies that summer, and it was always 3, 4, 5 o'clock where we were literally and figuratively sweating about, you know, whether or not the grid was going to go down. And that is just no longer 3, 4, 5 o'clock's not an issue anymore. It's really kind of now 6, 7, 8 o'clock, and then you get to battery storage, and where that is really jumping into the mix. So we are now just a couple stats on that, and then love to hear what Claire and Naomi are thinking on this topic as well. But at the time of Winter Storm Uri, we had 200 megawatts of storage in ERCOT. At the end of 2023, we were at 5,000, so about a 25x increase. At the end of 2024, we were at 10,000. So we doubled again last year. It is entirely possible it'll double again this year. Not predicting that, but like there's 20,000 megawatts of storage in the interconnection queue scheduled for 2025. We won't get 20,000, we're sure of that. We don't know how much below that it will be, but it is entirely possible we will end the year somewhere in that 16, 18, 20,000 megawatt range. And just one last thing on this, and I put this in my newsletter earlier this week. There's an ERCOT board meeting next week. ERCOT staff always files some very interesting presentations in advance of the board meetings. One of the things they did was they look at all the interconnection requests for the last 60 days. In the last 60 days, they have received 90 applications for energy storage projects. So if you take out the weekends and just take the working days, it's like 2 every single day at ERCOT. And these are the big ones. These are the greater than 10 megawatt ones. And that was twice as many applications as solar. So I think this might be the first year, again, not like predicting this yet. I may predict it in a couple months, but getting close to it, that like energy storage might be the #1 resource installed in ERCOT in 2025. So it's just an incredibly fast trajectory and doesn't appear to be slowing down at this point.
Yeah, and I love all those specific numbers. So, and just to, you know, contextualize that, there's a lot of other states that have passed specific state policies to encourage battery adoption, like, you know, mandating a certain amount. California spent a long time with a lot of policies kind of incubating this industry over the last decade, and then Texas kind of just came out of nowhere with no real storage policies, and it's just kind of happened because people are seeing the benefits of it. So, and that of course is, you know, helping clean up the grid, lower emissions during the hours that the solar and the storage is operating, and lowering costs also.
Well, can I just say real quick on that? I'll be fast. There is a little bit of a policy component, right? It's not like we're going to have X amount of storage by X date. But the policy that the legislature set in 1999 when the market was deregulated, and it is an energy-only market, and it is economic dispatch, so the lowest cost resource wins. Like that, those were policy decisions. And the decision to stay with that market structure is a policy decision. So battery storage is the most economical, and it's winning. So it's not like a policy mandate, right? It's not prescriptive, but it is a policy decision.
No, that's a really good point. Well, yeah, Claire, what have you seen in your reporting that kind of caught your attention about where we're at with clean energy in Texas right now?
Yeah, this is actually perfect because before I came to Texas, I spent a year in California reporting on climate and energy, and coming here, it's very obvious, you know, in California, a lot of the clean energy progress is driven by really climate change policy. Coming here, it's not markets. I mean, not to, you know, make a point y'all have already made, but I have friends who are surprised that in the reddest state, or the leading red state, is also the leading clean energy state. And I have to explain to them that that's not an ideological decision, it's a market decision. You know, Texas has lots of open land, lots of sun, perfect for solar. It is one of the fastest markets where you can build and actually connect to the grid, so developers want to come here. On the storage side, there's so much volatility in the market that ERCOT has an energy-only market, which means that generators are only paid for the energy that they actually produce rather than a capacity market. And so what that means for battery storage is that there's a lot of opportunity to be able to charge when electricity is cheap and plentiful on the grid and sell that back. And that's why we've seen really that boom in electricity or in energy storage build out. That's not to say, of course, that clean energy and the energy transition isn't political here. Something that I have been fascinated by coming to Houston specifically is the idea that Jane had mentioned earlier of this all of the above energy policy of an energy expansion rather than energy transition. It's also really been striking to see that as this clean energy industry develops here in Texas, it's, of course, now a lot of clean energy associations and companies with the new administration are sort of massaging their messaging to try to be friendly to that new administration and to try to highlight how they can help the new administration meet its goals of like domestic manufacturing, of energy dominance. All of that posturing and messaging has already been happening here in Texas. So it's not something that is, for maybe, not sure, maybe other energy reporters elsewhere or even outside of the US might be surprised at that change in messaging, but here it's something that we've already seen used successfully for the most part to try not to make the oil and gas industry here think that, we're here to replace you, we're here to complement you, which I just, especially coming from California, have found very, very interesting. There's a report that a consulting firm, I believe, called Aurora Energy Research had sent my way, and the entire point of the report was to say, energy storage has been deployed in ERCOT more than ever, but actually, so has natural gas. Because energy storage has been deployed more, we're able to fill up more of the ancillary services, and so the natural gas power plants can not fill up the ancillary service. And I just found that a really interesting positioning for energy storage to try to not step into another lane here in Texas.
Yeah, right. So there's this sort of, whenever you're kind of an ascendant force in a system, it's are you perceived as a threat to the previous leaders of that or complementary? And actually, that would be a great one to hear your views on, because you've covered more of the conventional oil and gas and kind of how they're developing and responding to this rise of renewables. What do we need to know here of like how this rise of clean energy is being perceived in that camp, and are they even finding ways to kind of work together that might be surprising if you're not paying close attention?
Yeah, well, I think what you'll hear from most of the really big energy companies is the all of the above approach. I'm sure you've all heard it. I'm sure many of you agree with it, where most of the oil and gas companies will say we do need renewable energy. We need fossil fuels as well. We need oil, we need gas, but renewable energy does have a role to play. We don't have to compete. And I think in Texas especially, what I've been seeing is there's such huge amounts of energy demand growth. That's just a fact. We're a huge state. We're having a ton of population growth. Data centers are up and coming, as I'm sure we'll talk more about later, and that could be connected to the grid. It might not be. We're seeing a lot of different solutions and how those are going to be powered. And then oil fields are trying to be more electrified. They're trying to find different ways to reduce their emissions and to decarbonize. And they're doing that in a variety of ways, including with renewable energy. And so the oil and gas companies are some of the big buyers of renewable energy to power their operations, or they're starting to more and more, as we're seeing. So I think that has been something where there is a bit of a competition in terms of rhetoric, in terms of policy, But in terms of demand and growth, there's kind of room for everything to continue growing. And something that I think has really benefited probably both industries, traditional oil and gas and more newer energy, renewables, is Houston, frankly. I'm going to brag a little bit about Houston, but we are the energy capital of the world, and as we've heard in the last few years, we've also been called the energy transition capital of the world. And I think there's really something to be said for renewable energy and energy transition companies will come here and will set up offices here, they'll set up headquarters here, and they do that because there's such energy expertise in this city, whether it's legal, whether it's engineering, whether it's permitting, whether it's supply chain, everything is here. So, it's a really great place for new companies to start, for other companies to expand, and I think that just makes it even more likely that they will then invest in Texas as well.
Yeah. Okay. So that was a fairly harmonious picture that we painted. Let's dig into where it might not all be friendly welcome for these kind of up and coming clean technologies. The Texas Legislature, which is in session now, they come every 2 years. Sounds like a good gig to me, but they. Okay, 600 a month. Maybe not gonna keep the lights on for me. But yeah, so the session has begun, and there's this sort of like I guess I don't know. It's like a tradition and a time-honored tradition of we have this incredible market-based energy system, like the leading, most competitive market in the whole country, and then the legislature comes to town and comes up with ways to try to distort the functioning of the market in interesting ways, and often in ways that tend to help the gas generators and then push down on the solar and wind and batteries, and that's just what I've observed from the outside. But let's check in on kind of what do we all need to know about this latest session? What are kind of the leading ideas emerging from Austin that might reshape the energy system we've just been describing?
Well, there's a bunch of refiles of bills. So I think for me, I want to reserve some skepticism until I see these bills move. Of course, some of these bills, I wasn't here for the last legislative session. I started in August of 2023, but what I've heard is that some of these bills did move quite far. There's a package of bills a refile from last session that would make it much harder to develop solar and wind projects, that would require pretty significant distances from residences, that would set up a new permitting regime where they would have to be approved by the Public Utility Commission of Texas, which is not an approval process that other kinds of power plants in the state have to face. There are interconnection studies with ERCOT, but to have that sort of public hearing process with the PUC is not something that's in place currently.
That sounds kind of like expanding the scope of government, a little bit more like.
Yeah, well, the PUC scope has expanded quite a bit just in the time that I've been here. It's certainly expanded a lot since Winter Storm Uri. So what I've been told is that last session, the renewable industry was able to ward off the passage of those bills basically by making a trade. Essentially, like, renewables were no longer eligible for what are known as Chapter 313 tax incentives. In exchange, they would not pass those bills that could have been very damaging and completely slowed the industry. So I guess what I'm curious about this time is, is there anything that the industry can trade this time? If not, then will these bills be able to move farther or even pass the way that they weren't last year? New this year is a series of battery storage bills. There's definitely, especially in Houston and Hill Country, as more and more battery storage projects, utility scale specifically, battery storage projects have been built. There's been local opposition to some of these projects. I know, Julian, you wrote a very good story on the Moss Landing fire.
Oh, thank you. CanaryMedia.com. You can find it there.
Have y'all heard of it? Have you check it out?
Yes, definitely read
Really
it.
good.
And it, that fire, the Arizona fire that injured firefighters, residents in the area do read those stories, and it does make them nervous about a similar fire near their homes or near their businesses. I've been following this issue in the Houston area. There's a city that's already passed an ordinance on battery storage, just another one that's considering one. There's another city that has basically denied all battery storage applications that's come before them and have said, if another one comes, they probably know that they'll be denied. So definitely some local opposition already slowing projects here, and now the state legislature is coming in and wanting to create some statewide requirements, pretty similar to the wind and solar, to create that permitting process with the PUC, some hearings, this really significant setback distance. So those are the main ones when it comes to renewables that I've been looking at. I mean, there's another refiled for 50% of the energy generated on the Texas grid to be quote unquote dispatchable, which depending on who you ask may or may not include batteries, so who knows?
The definition in the bill does not include batteries.
Even though, batteries are dispatchable, if we look at the definition of dispatchable, and so don't know if that one really has legs, but it's there. So yeah, those are the main bills I would watch for on the renewable sector.
That sounds pretty daunting maybe for the industry. I don't know if some of you all would probably have your work impacted by this. And it does sound like I'm hearing a bit of favoritism perhaps. It's almost like it's an equal playing field, except these particular ones have to jump through more hoops and go through more permitting and more centrally planned government oversight, and all the other ones don't have to for some reason. I'm sure there's very good reasoning behind that, but is there a real groundswell of interest in these kind of bills? Is there a problem being fixed by them that real people are having, or is it just kind of a thing that's coming out of the politicians' ideas? Maybe.
There certainly are stories around the state of, people impacted by development on neighbors' land. It is interesting that the main bill Claire was talking about was the refile SB 819 by Senator Colkhorst only applies to wind, solar, and storage. None of these setbacks or permitting requirements for oil and gas. So in the state of Texas, you can drill an oil or gas well I think it's about 100 feet from a nursing home or a child care facility. HB 40 in 2015, you can look that up. The city of Denton had passed some local ordinances to require setbacks of oil and gas drilling because of the drilling that was going on up there. And the legislature said, nope, you can't do that. But now, the Senate at least, and again, the House didn't pass the version in 2023, but the Senate did. The bill invokes, and this is verbatim from the bill, the police power of the state. You can look it up, it's in the bill, by a conservative Republican to tell property owners what they can and cannot do on their property. And the setbacks, to be clear, 3,000 feet, a little more than a half a mile. This is not a bill looking to just protect. It's a bill intended to kneecap the renewable industry. Now, the interesting thing about that is, you heard from Jane Stricker before, right? Houston Energy Transition Initiative. You have a lot of this, what she was saying about transition and expansion. You have a lot of these oil and gas companies that are trying to connect to the grid to buy renewable energy because it makes their costs lower. Right, so for most of the last year, West Texas Intermediate, a barrel is $70. The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, on their survey of oil executives, says that to break even on a new well, you need between $63 and $70. If you can lower the input cost of making a barrel of oil, because you're not using diesel generation and you're connecting to the grid to buy cheap wind and solar, you're more competitive against the Saudis and the Qataris. It's a global, so, who they think they're helping here, I'm not sure, you'd have to ask them, but it's not helpful. Solar and storage is what we're building in Texas. We had 13 gigawatts connected to the grid last year, about 11 and a half of that was solar and storage. gas takes, there's a NextEra slide that's been floating around on social media over the last week. NextEra says that, you know, if you're going to build gas, it's going to take 3 to 5 years. Solar and storage, you can pretty much build immediately. Now, in some grids, PJM or MISO, it takes a long time. Here, you can really connect it in 12 to 18 months. And we have all this demand growth from industrial electrification, oil and gas electrification, data centers, so on and so forth. So if you're going to take that away, what does that mean for the state's economy? You know, Governor Abbott really likes to hold up those trophies that he's won 12 years in a row from Site Selection Magazine. Part of the reason companies move here and he wins that trophy is because of lower energy costs. So if those bills pass, it'd do major damage to the state. Now, I'll just say one more thing. I know I've been talking a long time. I'll stop. I want to hear what Naomi wants to think about this too. But I just want to say this. I think it's really important because there's a lot of positive things the legislature could do, and there's a lot of positive things that are being considered. And I think we're going to talk about some of these. There's the Railroad Commission had a Hydrogen Policy Development Council. They made a bunch of recommendations to advance green and blue hydrogen. There was the governor convened through the PUC an Advanced Nuclear Reactor Working Group. They made 7 recommendations that will require a number of different bills from the legislature. There's a Texas Energy Fund that's supposed to put $1.8 billion towards microgrids at hospitals and nursing homes and water treatment facilities and police stations and fire stations. So when the next Hurricane Beryl happens, those facilities are up and running. The legislature is going to have to decide, are we all about putting something down, or are we about building up industries? And I think as Texans, I think the vast majority of Texans would prefer the latter.
Yeah, a lot in there. Anything you wanted to add on that, or?
I think they mostly covered it. I think the only thing I'll add, it's actually a slight pivot, but I think it'll also be interesting to then see how all of the Texas legislative actions interact with federal actions now that Donald Trump is in office again. And we've already seen he has his executive order that put a pause on both onshore and offshore wind leasing on federal land and waters. Now, that doesn't affect Texas all that much because we mostly have private land, but it did, you know, at least for now, potentially put a pause on an offshore wind lease sale that was supposed to happen in 2026. That's kind of uncertain now what the fate of that is going to be. But there was already been a lot of pushback against offshore wind from Texas regulators. And so it'll just be interesting to see how kind of the just kind of how the state and the federal actions play against each other or with each other.
No, I think that's a really good point. I mean, we've also seen, you know, it's just been like a week, I guess, or a little more, but some freezing of federal grants for energy, grants and funding that in many cases were promised and signed and contracted and now are frozen. And so, you know, raises some questions about the trustworthiness of the federal government of the United States in delivering on legally binding contracts that they have, which is sort of important for an economy generally, for there to be some understanding shared about that. I do wonder, I mean, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with the Inflation Reduction Act, which created all these, you know, tax credits that are kind of fundamental to the really huge growth of wind and solar and renewables lately. And you know, there's some folks are fairly bullish they will continue because they're actually creating so many jobs in a lot of red districts around the country. Have any of y'all heard discussion in Texas of like what would happen if wind and solar and battery tax credits like disappeared? Like, I mean, we don't know if that's going to happen, but are folks preparing for that, or do we have a sense of what it would mean for the growth in ERCOT if that suddenly went away from Washington?
I actually wrote a story right after Trump was elected about how if the tax credits were scaled back dramatically, Texas would be the state that would be the most affected, but also simply because it is the state with the largest pipeline of clean energy projects. That said, what's really interesting about that is also that I've heard from analysts and some companies in this space that, you know, if that were to be the case, if tax credits were to be dramatically scaled back in some way, if they have a whole portfolio of projects, they might actually be more keen to develop their project in Texas because they can connect to the grid faster and get that operating faster. And since there's still so much energy demand, and Naomi talked about that earlier, there's still so much energy demand here that I think that it still makes economic sense for a lot of these developers to build here. I think it'll just be slowed down as it would be elsewhere, but I think because of where we are and because of everything we've already talked about, Texas would still remain the leader in the clean energy space. But on the pause on federal grants and loans, I did want to highlight too that something that I think really affects everyday Houstonians and Texans more is the fact that part of the program that's now kind of up in flux and up in the air is this program called Solar for All from the Biden administration's EPA. Harris County led a coalition of counties and cities across the state and I don't have the exact figure right now, but it was hundreds of millions.
250 million.
Yeah, 250 million to basically help low-income Texans install solar on their rooftops, and to also pioneer this idea of putting solar on community centers so that, we get a lot of hurricanes. If there's a hurricane, people can go to their community center to recharge, to get food, get water, to stay the night even. And with that funding, I spoke to a part of that coalition earlier this week for a different story, and nobody has any idea what's going to happen with that funding. The Texas Southern University also led a different coalition that got $156 million from Solar for All, and their idea is to install solar on HBCUs across the Southeast and be able to help those campuses decarbonize. So these programs that really would, sometimes we talk about the clean energy transition, we talk about clean energy, and it's hard for people who are outside of this space to really perhaps have that top of mind. But these programs that would really directly impact people and really be able to deliver the benefits of clean energy to people, those, maybe the utility scale projects, even if the tax credits are gone, would be fine. But some of these families who really could use backup power or really could use lower energy bills from programs like Solar for All, they could be some of the biggest losers.
There's another, federal program that I'll be watching very closely is the what's called HOMES, and here Texas had the largest allocation of all of the states, $690 million for low and moderate income Texans, and the way that's defined, actually in the Houston area, my understanding is you could be making somewhere around $100,000 for family of four and still get help, and that matters because it was specifically focused on air conditioning units. There's other things that can be done on that, but in Texas, one of the biggest cause of Winter Storm Uri was inefficient heat, and to actually have $690 million to go retrofit homes, help people lower their bills, and benefit the grid, if that money gets taken away, our risk of outages in the 3 to 5 year period goes up quite a bit, because demand during Uri was sort of a little bit of an untold story. I've been trying to tell it, but a little bit of an untold story that we don't know how much demand was, but it almost certainly was above 90,000 megawatts. ERCOT still thinks it was, their official estimate 77, but they now said that if this winter we had a winter storm Uri, we would need 97,000 megawatts, because I think they're finally starting to understand that resistance heat is a big problem, and if it goes down to 5 degrees, you can't possibly serve that load unless you do energy efficiency. Just one other thing on the tax credits. I think this is well known, but like there was a letter that 18 House Republicans sent to Speaker Johnson before the election. 14 of those Republicans are still in Congress, saying, I think the phrasing was something like use a scalpel on this IRA, and because a lot of those tax credits are benefiting their districts. It is going to be very, very hard, particularly on like 45X, the manufacturing tax credits, to go in and take those away when they'll have to go back to their district and face thousands of people whose jobs are eliminated because of a vote they took. And don't forget the margins in the House, it's 2. Right, it's 219 to 215. It'll be, when Gates' special election happens, it'll be 220, 215. But so like, if you lose 2 or 3, That's it. That's all it takes. 2 or 3, literally 2 now, 3 after the next election, after the election in April for Matt Gaetz' seat, 3 members of Congress can stop any of those cuts from happening. So the pressure is going to be extraordinary. And the thing I'd say about 45Y, which is the solar and wind and battery, now batteries qualify for them. I think it absolutely would slow down development. But here's the other thing it would do: it would raise energy costs. So if you're looking for energy inflation, if that's your policy goal, this would be a good way to achieve it. The whole thing around, I think this is fascinating. Like, it's gonna be fascinating to watch how President Trump wants to either throw aside or decide he wants to use the IRA. Because if you're talking about energy dominance and you're talking about America's competitiveness against China, the IRA is a pretty darn good policy for it. And most Americans don't understand that Biden passed it. He could just run around the country taking credit for all this stuff. Or he could throw it all out and have energy costs go through the roof and have people pissed off at him. It's going to be fascinating.
I was asking people like a year ago, are we worried about IRA funding being cut off? Are we worried about, companies who have made major business decisions regarding projects and regarding funding? Are we worried about that funding not coming through? And everybody I was talking to a year ago was like, nah, it's fine. Like, we're not worried about it. That funding's gonna go through. Like, there's no, maybe there might be some rollbacks, but it'll definitely go through. And now we have a freeze in funding. And I actually just saw a press release. I think it was from some Montana project. I don't cover Montana, so I don't know what it was. But they were saying that they were supposed to get their funding that day, and they had gotten an email or a letter or whatever saying your funding is at least delayed because we are getting guidance from the administration on if we're supposed to give you this funding or not. So I think I'm very interested to see what happens. I'm also paying a lot of attention to the decarbonization technologies that aren't necessarily power generation, but reduce emissions, so CCS and hydrogen, because those are 2 technologies that are still scaling up. They are still working to become more cost effective, less expensive, and right now for most people, for most companies, they're not profitable, they're not cost effective, they can't really do it. And there are tax credits, and there are, pilot programs and things like that to bring down those costs, but it's still all pretty early stages. And a lot of it was going to depend on favorable policy in being able to move forward with them. And, I haven't seen anything specific yet against them, but, I am just curious to see if and when, especially CCS. This is a little niche, but I've personally been waiting to hear on offshore CCS regulations. I've heard that there's some potential, maybe shallow water Gulf of Mexico for some offshore CCS.
This is for the geology that you can actually pump carbon dioxide underground and store it.
Yes.
The Gulf has these,
Yes.
is it salt dome
Yes, there's
or-
also you can use depleted oil reservoirs.
okay,
yeah. And so that's kind of where the shallow water Gulf of Mexico comes in play. But there's no permitting structure and regulation structure for offshore CCS in federal waters. And we were supposed to get that regulation 2 years ago now, I think. And then somebody said it was supposed to come out end of 2024. It has not come out as far as I know. I've been paying attention. So now the question is, well, will it ever come out? And so
Right.
it's, again, it was just a potential for something. There wasn't anything planned, really. There was some speculation. A couple big oil majors were buying up some offshore leases in the shallow water where, it's I don't think you're going to produce any more oil there. And people were kind of speculating it was going to be for CCS. But again, that regulation doesn't exist, and now I'm curious to see if it ever will. So
and that's a great. So you mentioned these other forms of clean energy. We've been talking about the wind and the solar and the batteries, which is all here and now, and bigger here than any other state. But yeah, there's other types of clean energy or potential vehicles for clean energy. Hydrogen's a big one for this area particularly. So yeah, let's do a little status report on we got hydrogen. There's geothermal. We'll hear more about that later in the next session. But advanced nuclear or
Lithium.
miniature nuclear, yeah, like lithium kind of mining type of plays. Yeah, what do we need to know about the state of play on hydrogen, for instance? Because Houston and the Gulf Coast here, the biggest hub of conventional hydrogen already, which is, you know, basically it's split methane into CO2 and hydrogen, and you keep the hydrogen and let the CO2 go straight up into the atmosphere because no one cared about that, apparently. There's, you know, this potential for a like billion-dollar clean hydrogen new industry to kind of spring up out of nowhere. There's a hub. There's a $1 billion roughly grant from the Department of Energy if grants are a thing that continues to exist, and that's all supposed to happen here. But have you seen any like tangible signs of this new potentially billion-dollar clean energy industry springing into existence yet? Any like specific projects or things moving beyond the planning stages here in Texas?
I think what I've seen, now I first will just mention that hydrogen is already a huge industry, just maybe not what would be considered clean hydrogen, you know? Like, people use hydrogen. It is an important product.
There's pipelines here that
Yeah.
transport it. It's a big part of the petrochemical inputs into these huge, you know, petrochemical facilities around here.
Sure. And so I think a big part of scaling up hydrogen kind of goes back to CCS, because if you're going to do blue hydrogen, which is the steam reforming, and then you kind of add CCS to it and you reduce those emissions. And that is where I'm seeing, especially a lot of the oil and gas companies that have the capital to put into newer projects like that, you know, they're definitely focusing on that, because some of them already produce it, and those that don't, it's like, this is going to be more profitable for them. It makes more sense for them to dive into it this way. But again, then that depends on the CCS, and the CCS has to be cost effective, and there has to be a market. So now we have to scale up CCS, but it's always the chicken and the egg situation where you need to sign up contracts with emitters to take their CCS to store it, but they don't want to do that till they have infrastructure. It's a whole issue of just the classic issue that a lot of industries deal with in trying to scale up. And so that's why incentives were really important. There were a lot of facilities that, with 45Q tax credits, now CCS is becoming cost effective and profitable for them, and they can afford it. And so if that happens and scales up CCS, that has a potential to scale up hydrogen. But again, since it all is such early stages, it'll be interesting to see if and when people really move forward. But again, there have been, we see ExxonMobil, they have a big hydrogen project they're planning at Baytown, and they have a lot of capital commitments and equity commitments that were being committed kind of last fall. But they were very clear that they were waiting on 45V tax credit policy to come out, which came out right at the end of 2024.
A lot of 45.
Yes, a lot of 45s. So if they stick to their timeline, they'll be getting ready to hit FID soon.
Okay.
But I don't know exactly when and if that'll happen. But
Have any of you gotten to like do reporting on the ground at a hydrogen or a carbon capture project that has broken ground? No, okay, not yet. Come back in a year or two. Okay, let's jump to nuclear. It sounds like there is some real momentum around that in Texas. That one's like consistently bipartisan, actually, in its appeal. Even under the first Trump administration, Congress passed some kind of small and targeted nuclear policy laws to like reform the permitting and regulatory situation. What's the outlook for Texas specifically, and like what format of it might come into existence here first? Yeah.
You want me to start? You want me to start or you want to start?
I can start. Well, I think the biggest supporter of nuclear in Texas is Greg Abbott, which helps the industry. He has been very interested in nuclear, and he, like Doug talked about earlier, he convened a working group within the PUC to give him a report on how Texas can become the global leader in nuclear. That report came out, I believe, November. All the months have blurred together. It had 7 recommendations. 2 of them that are really interesting to me are they want to create a Texas Nuclear Energy Fund, which would be similar to the Texas Energy Fund, which is this, so far, $5 billion fund. All of that so far has been reserved to give developers low-interest loans to build natural gas power plants.
It's a free market mechanism to lend taxpayer dollars to specific competitors in the marketplace, right? Is that?
Yeah, it's funny
So
because the
cynical.
way I've heard it described is, in the legislature at least, is they want to level the playing field. They said, the federal government is giving wind and solar so many subsidies, so now we got to give gas subsidies. I mean, I don't think the playing field was leveled to begin with. But, anyway, on the nuclear front, there also is a Texas supply, or like Texas Nuclear Energy Supply Chain Fund, which would hopefully build out this industry here, is what their goal is.
Is that for like the fuel, developing the?
Yeah, and like the parts. They want not only for there to be more nuclear power plants in Texas, but also for nuclear power plants that are going to be built elsewhere. They want that industry here. They want the industry here. They want all those parts built here. They want the expertise here. Texas A&M has been very keen on showing that it is very supportive of this agenda. Texas A&M has offered its land, its Rellis campus in Bryan, for its invited companies to try to apply to build reactors on that campus. So, a lot of movement, a lot of ambition, but, it's early days. I am also going to be interested to see if the legislature does indeed create those funds and how much that would be if it is in the billions, as, the Texas Energy Fund is.
And would these be for like the classic large scale gigawatt?
No.
Okay.
They're specifically looking at small modular nuclear reactors, which is smaller and is cheaper because they're built by. The idea is that you can make a lot of these parts and put them together, and then safer depending on who you ask. So, again, a lot of concepts, and specifically Texas A&M hopes that its campus can be like a proving ground for an SMR. Though, with how expensive they are to build, and just how quickly those costs escalate and all the challenges in building one, probably not going to be within the decade thing to meet the incredible demand growth that we're seeing here.
Yeah, I just this week, yesterday, the day before, I recorded a podcast with Commissioner Gladfelter. He just cycled off the commission, but he led that advanced nuclear reactor working group. And when you listen to that, you'll hear us talk about, and I know you're going to listen, about how the working group really focused, and their recommendation focuses on this too, really trying to make the small modular reactors actually modular with the parts fabricated here in Texas. The idea being, and a lot of the members of the working group were from the oil and gas industry. There's a gentleman named Doug Robison, who's CEO of Natura Resources out in Abilene, spent his whole career in oil and gas, and is now leading this nuclear company that got the first license from the NRC for a test reactor in, I think it's like a generation or something like that. So that's the idea, is really trying to build an industry here. If you get a chance, I really learned so much from David Roberts. You might have heard of him from Volts, interviewing Jigger Shaw, a whole episode on nuclear. And I think it was in that podcast that Jigger said that small modular reactors, the problem is they're neither small nor modular. And so I think the idea is really to actually have, and they wouldn't necessarily be small, they could be 200 or 300 megawatts, but actually modular, and really try to build that industry here in Texas. And again, I'll just say, I'm really hopeful that is really where the legislature puts more of their focus on these hopeful, visions of innovation and of building new economies, rather than trying to push some resources which are clearly bringing benefit. Rather than
Well, and that's a thoughtful approach to try to bring the supply chain and the manufacturing side of it too. So now that we'll save the geothermal for next session, because that's going to be covered in depth. We want to get some questions from the audience for the next few minutes before we wrap up. So we have Stephanie over there with a microphone, and if we want to do, I see your hand first. Please say your name and a nice succinct question that ends with a question mark, and we'll get through as many as we can. Yeah, thanks.
First, thanks to the panel for your comments coming from a lot of directions that we all have interested in. I'm a geologist, so I'm peripherally related in a number of these aspects. Given that none of us are safe as long as our one and only legislature are here for 140 days, and likelihood is that only the items on the so-called emergency list are going to get addressed, maybe some others coming in. Knowing that Naomi and Claire may be constrained in what you can reply to, what are the 2 or 3 things that we ought to keep on our committee phone memory to dial in on as this session addresses the items that have been regarded as emergency or priority during the legislative session between now and the beginning of June? Thank you.
Like kind of what is the most realistic threat that might have, like what's sort of most likely to advance in a way that would destabilize the clean energy market? Is that what you were saying? Yeah.
Well, I think a lot of the things I'm watching for from the legislature aren't some things we actually talked about. So I'll, of course, the renewable bills and whether or not they actually advance. But also, I think the fact that Texas needs to build more than 3,000 miles of transmission lines, almost like a CREZ 2.0 in terms of scale, is something that is going to be a big topic of discussion, not only to connect clean energy to big cities, but also because oil and gas companies want to electrify because of data centers, because of crypto, and then how the number that ERCOT actually just published on Friday, the estimate to build all that transmission is 30.8 to 33 billion. That's not including another 20 billion of projects that are either currently in engineering and construction or are under review. So, $50 billion worth of transmission. Electricity bills are already rising with the storm restoration costs and with just traditional growth. So how are those costs going to be allocated? And then I would say the last thing from the legislature, I'm sure they're probably going to pass another $5 billion for the Texas Energy Fund. That's something that's a big focus for the lieutenant governor. He calls the Texas Energy Fund, that $5 billion fund for natural gas power plants, his baby. And so how will the next $5 billion actually be used? Is that $1.8 billion that was supposed to be used for microgrids, are those rules going to advance? How are the $1 billion for grid improvements outside of ERCOT, is that going to advance? It's in the bill that was passed in 2023, but the way that Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick have been talking about doubling the size of the energy fund, they've only been referring to it as we desperately need to build more gas plants on the grid now. So is that going to change in any way?
Gotcha. Let's keep it at that. And then maybe any quick thoughts on it? Like if you were a clean energy lobbyist in this hypothetical, what would be like top of your concern list there?
Senate Bill 819, which is the one we talked about earlier for sure. There's a bill that is not filed yet, but is a topic of a lot of discussion, which is a bill specifically focused on large loads and how large loads are allowed to or not allowed to interconnect to the grid. That'll be certainly one to watch for. I agree, transmission. I agree, Texas Energy Fund. The other one I would throw in there is something related to energy efficiency. There will be some bills filed on that. There have been a few so far. There'll be some more. But that is really a critical element to make sure that the grid can make it through winter storms.
2 words, ditto transmission.
Hey. Okay.
I think that's really important.
I see a hand over here. Can we get a microphone there?
How do we balance the narrative of dispatchability and duration to ensure technology neutrality?
Ooh.
Can you say a couple words more? What do you mean by that? What do you
Is this an
So
energy
like
storage?
natural gas, dispatchable, batteries, dispatchable, batteries, currently short-term dispatchable.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Helpful.
Are you asking from the perspective of a comms person?
Yes, exactly. You guys work in media. How do you talk about technology neutrality so it's not just natural gas, especially without carbon sequestration?
Yeah. Okay, that's a good point. So yeah, there's these sort of broader public discussions around what power plants are really reliable and trustworthy, and a lot of things can end up being conflated in those, like a gas plant with frozen pipes and no gas is actually not as reliable as a battery with a full state of charge, but they often kind of get lumped into a category where it's either reliable and dispatchable or not. Yeah, any thoughts on where this could go? Sort of, not that you all are representing the industry, but.
I actually stopped using dispatchable in my reporting. I don't think it's a very useful term for the general public. I think it's, especially in Texas, become more of like a buzzword. I think instead of using that word, if I were a comms person and I was speaking to somebody in the media, especially somebody that doesn't report on the grid the way that we do, I would explain exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about dispatchable. I would talk about, what does that reliability really mean? Like, we can provide energy over this period of time. This is the benefits that we bring compared to other technologies. These are how other technologies have drawbacks. These are our drawbacks, because I think if you promote your technology as like, we have no flaws, nobody is going to believe you.
I think that's a really good point, and I think it kind of goes along with the term clean. If we're talking about clean energy, I've gotten to a habit, anytime I say clean with quotation marks, because it's like, what does that even mean? It can mean a lot of different things, and so I think that's a really, really good point, and something to think about is what terms are you using, and what does that mean to different people?
And I'll just say, look, I think, number one, let's not forget that for most of the history of the ERCOT grid, everybody has been worried about the summertime and summer peaks, and like solar has kind of like solved that problem. And then everybody was like, oh, but there's these net ramps and you'll never be able to deal with that when the sun goes down, and storage is kind of solving that problem. And I feel like what's going on is like we're the baseball team that just signed a guy that hits 50 home runs, but dude, you don't steal bases. Like you don't pitch, so you're no good. Like, no, like, define the attribute you want and celebrate those sources for their attributes, and understand that, like, there's 9 players on a baseball field, not just one, and, like, it's a system. It should work together. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I think that's – and you can also point out kind of the very measurable effects that the batteries have already had, like all last summer. Yeah. You could kind of see on I think August 20th was the record demand, kind of heat wave, and you can see the solar taking out a chunk of it when the sun's up, and then the batteries coming in, and they basically suppressed a spike in the prices, even though it was this record heat, record air conditioning consumption. And you don't actually need to be a battery that runs for 24 hours to have a really meaningful impact and lower prices for everyone. I think they were going for an hour or two, and just at the right time, and so
literally 90 to 95% of the problems on the grid are an hour or two. Really, an hour. There are other problems, and we should deal with those other problems. But let's definitely celebrate that storage is.
Yeah. Okay. I think we could do one or two more. I saw you there.
Amazing panel so far. Just a quick question on the financing of these climate tech and clean energy projects. So recently, in the past few years, we've seen venture capital sort of exit this market as these VC and venture funds really needed to be hands-on investors guiding these engineers. But they just found that the policy wasn't necessarily constant throughout the years, as well as just not seeing good returns. Same with private equity, same with corporate investment. So where do you think M&A has a role to play in the upcoming, scaling of climate tech, clean energy? And is this a positive thing, or with M&A, is there a certain aspect that's lost with climate tech and clean energy, I guess?
Okay. And do you mean in terms of legacy companies buying up startups, or?
Yeah, just take with the question whatever you want.
Okay. Yeah. It's kind of a clean tech VC trends question. Anyone got some thoughts on that?
Should answer that question.
I'm not sure if this exactly answers the question, but I think something to pay attention to is I just wrote an article recently that there's a lot of funds out there that focus on all types of energy, both renewable and traditional, and traditional energy is pretty stable right now after a lot of ups and downs with COVID, with Russia invading Ukraine, things like that. The prices, for better or worse, the prices have been pretty stable for a while, which gives a lot of confidence to venture capital. And so there's some projections that there's some of those funds that go back and forth are going to be a little more focused on the traditional energy in the next year or so. The people that I've talked to who have said that have said it's not like people are going to stop investing in renewable energy. It just might slow down a little bit compared to what they were hoping or expecting, which, you know, I think that's not a very optimistic answer, but I think, you know, really paying attention to the funds and the private equity and the companies that are really committed specifically to clean tech rather than just all energy, just depending on the business. You know, like it's really going to have to be specific focuses on clean tech and energy transition if they want to move that forward.
Gotcha. I'm gonna look for guidance. Do we have one more? No, it's time to wrap it up. Okay, because we have some very fun networking coming up for y'all, and I don't want to stand in the way of that. But first, could you all stand up and let's give a round of applause to this panel? They did a great job. Read all their work. You're in Houston, they're around here, you know, support your local journalists, and thanks for being here. Have a great networking break. Okay, everybody else, we got you. Okay, we've got critical mass. It's moving in the right direction. But we love seeing the eagerness to mingle and talk. That's a really good sign. That's really why we do these. We like getting people in the room. You know, we love engaging with you via the email newsletter for free at canarymedia.com. But getting to see people face to face, that's really special. That's special. You never know what you're going to find when you get everybody in the room together. All right. Well, I think this is looking pretty good. So we'll ask just everyone else if you bring the chatter down, bring that chatter down to quiet. And we're going to welcome Julia Travellini from our hosts here at Greentown Labs. She's going to say a few words that everyone will listen to quietly and silently. And then we will kick it off with the final stage of our program. Thank you, everybody, for simmering down out there. And let's give a round of applause to Julia.
Thank you. Awesome. I know it's so hard to interrupt the conversations. You just had like an hour-long dialogue with brilliant people talking about a lot of wonderful things. So thank you for coming back from the kitchen. One last call. So my name is Julia Travellini. I have the privilege of being part of the Greentown Labs team. I'm actually based at our Boston incubator, so it's so fun to be here in the Houston ecosystem. Thank you for the very warm welcome. I oversee marketing and communications at Greentown, so I have a very deep appreciation for the work that Canary and our other brilliant panelists do to help tell the story of the energy transition, of the industry, keep all of us informed of all the wonderful things happening here in Houston and beyond. Nick asked me to come up and say a few words. So first and foremost, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here. I think a lot of you said you were first-time Canary event attendees, which is wonderful. We had the privilege of hosting a Canary event at our Boston incubator as well. So it's great to have the tour continuing. Anyone first time to Greentown, Houston? Awesome. We love making new friends and welcoming more folks from the community to Greentown. So I hope you'll come back. We host a ton of events. My colleague Benita in the back taking photos spearheads our events, does a great job. So please sign up for our newsletter, come engage with our ecosystem, come meet our member companies. So Greentown expanded, if you haven't heard, and I'll be brief. We opened Greentown Houston in 2021 with the goal of helping be a convener and catalyst for the entrepreneurs in this ecosystem building next-gen technologies, one of whom you're going to hear from in just a moment for this conversation. Tim was one of the catalysts for the entrepreneurial community, and I think has really set an example for entrepreneurs that are just coming up with their ideas here in Houston, spinning out of industry, spinning out of universities, and want to go build something really amazing and impressive. And he's sort of, I think, served as a role model for folks who want to take that big leap of faith and be courageous and build something amazing. And he's really done that. And he was an early advocate for the Greentown community here in Houston. So he's been with us from the beginning, and we're really grateful for his leadership. And so with that, I'm here to activate and welcome Tim and David up to the stage for a great conversation about their next-gen geothermal technology and building a climate tech energy transition company. Thanks.
Hey, hey. Hi, everybody. Jeez. That's, being interrogated. The interrogating. Hi, everybody. Okay, so a few years ago, well, actually, even more years ago, like, I think it was 2019, I wrote an article about geothermal power at Vox, where I worked at the time, because I had sort of just started kind of hearing it out of the corner of my ear a couple of times, and I had sort of been vaguely aware of it, and I was just like, well, what's going on with that? And so I went out on what turned into a journey of discovery into turns out lots of stuff going on. And one of the companies I came across was Fervo in the advanced geothermal. And so then Tim, when he had done, I think, his first sort of like test, came on the podcast, sort of had just basically demonstrated that the technology could work, came on the pod. And that was 2 years ago. And lots has happened even since then. So I'm here mostly to catch up, but just to sort of, to set the stage, maybe you could just start I'm assuming most people in this audience know, but maybe just give us like the minute-long, what is the technology in question here?
Yeah, well, I have to say a lot more people know the answer to that question because of your 2019 article. This kind of was maybe an example of how off the radar geothermal is. Sometimes I'm asked now, like, oh, why doesn't anybody talk about geothermal? Or alternatively, I'm asked, like, what's all the hype around geothermal? And I'm like, well, both of those things can't be true. And I always remember the days before you wrote that article in 2019, where I think for the next at least 2 or 3 years, everyone had either never heard of Fervo before or they directly cited your one article on the topic. So I appreciate you for putting a spotlight on it. And I do think we're part of the conversation now a lot. So like, everybody should listen to David's podcast and read all the articles he writes because
And subscribe.
you can find out what the trends are 6 years ahead of schedule. So it's been a while. But for those who still don't know, one, go read David's article on it. But geothermal is a way to get energy, and that can be heat. That can be heat that we use directly, or it can be heat that we then convert to electricity. And it's an energy resource that's been around as electricity generation for over 100 years. The first geothermal power plant came online in Italy over 100 years ago. By the way, sitting 5 feet away from me is Ann Robertson-Tate, who's run Geothermex for a couple of decades. And so I'm way more nervous about getting anything wrong about geothermal than I normally am. So if y'all hear a loud woman proclaiming that I'm wrong about something, you know who it is. But thank you. She said she's going to be tame. But that first plant came online over 100 years ago, and basically all geothermal power works the same way. There's heat in the ground, and you figure out a way to get that heat moved up in a way where you can spin a turbine. And historically, we've only really had the drilling technology to make that work if you're sitting on top of really special geologic hotspots. So Italy was first, but people famously, Iceland gets most of its energy from geothermal, Northern California, New Zealand, Kenya. There's countries all over the world that get it, but they all face these characteristics where you can make power from it by producing steam or hot water, spinning a turbine with it to generate electricity. But historically, it's been limited to these specific hotspots. I'm sure you're going to ask us what Fervo does in the future, but generally, the basic concept of what Fervo does is that geothermal has all the things you want in an energy resource. It's 24/7, it's carbon-free, it's quick to build, it's proven tech, but historically, it has only worked when you're sitting on top of one of these hotspots. And so there's been R&D initiatives for a long, long time to say, what can we do with drilling technology, stimulation technology, fracturing technology, you name it, to try to get geothermal to work in more places, and that's what Fervo does. But that's the basic concept is the Earth is hot, we can use that heat for something. One of those things we can use it for is to generate electricity.
And just to toot Tim's home a little more, the big advance here is that Tim has taken fracking technology borrowed from the natural gas industry, and so now he can go down and create fissures underground, which then he can circulate water through, and it heats up. So you don't have to find fissures anymore. You can make them, which means you can do it, maybe not anywhere, but a lot more places, a lot more places than you used to be able to do it. So it's a really cool story. So, but back when I talked to you, you were just planning on building basically your first actual bona fide power plant for Google. That was 2 years ago. You built the plant. You came out with a white paper about the results. It was pretty eye-popping. Why don't you tell us what you guys figured out building your first plant?
Yeah, so even though EGS, enhanced geothermal systems, has been something that had been worked on since the 1970s. It was Los Alamos National Labs and the Department of Energy that first kind of put the research dollars into this and learned a lot of really interesting things. And there's been projects in Japan and France and Finland and all over the world moving forward, but most of them had fallen short of the technical results that you really needed to prove out commercial viability. And a lot of that came down to flow rate. So it's very expensive to drill. And if you're going to drill, you need to make sure you're getting a high energy output per well that you drill. And so one of the things we set out is a bunch of different targets in terms of power output per well. And by the way, for the scope of some of this project, what we did is we found a geothermal power plant in northern Nevada that had been producing for about 15 years, but they'd oversized the power plant relative to what the actual field could produce, which is a situation you find all the time in geothermal, because the scary thing about conventional geothermal development is you drill a couple wells and it looks good, you size your power plant, you build it, then you drill a couple wells and oh no, you've got a dry hole. And so this plant found its way in that situation where the plant could produce more power than the amount of geothermal steam that was able to flow to the plant. And so we decided to go out to one of the areas in the southern part of the field where they'd had multiple dry holes using conventional drilling technology, and we did the first kind of Fervo system, which is really, as you mentioned, we're borrowing fracking technology from the oil and gas industry. But that actually wasn't new for geothermal. That had been tried before. But the new twist on it that we had was the integration of horizontal drilling into the process. So this project, we drilled about 8,000 feet down, and then through Granite, we were able to turn the bit horizontally and drill 3,000 feet plus horizontally. We put two wells next to each other, parallel, at that 8,000 feet down, and flowed through the fractures from one well to the other. And the key thing that made our geothermal work was when you turn horizontally, you get access to way more hot rock per well that you drill than a vertical well. And so we were able to flow across a much larger system of rock, so we could get way higher flow rates, and importantly, they could sustain at the same temperature for a lot longer. So we flow tested that well. We were able to show that it could flow at over 60 liters per second, which at that power plant operational efficiency means it could that our two-well system could produce over 3 megawatts of electricity, and that was more than double what any other enhanced geothermal system technology had done, and it was also 10 times higher than what I would say the average output of prior EGS attempts, and all because we could get more bang for our buck because of the horizontal drilling. And then we were just talking to you about how excited we were about the well test results. The exciting thing for us was a couple months later, we were able to build the pipeline, tie that into the power plant, get that system online, actually producing electrons that went to the grid through part of our partnership with Google. And sort of the second big de-risking thing that project was able to do is in October of last year, we hit 12 months of production, and we're able to maintain the same production temperature from day one all the way through day 365, which is one of the other risks of geothermal, is if you don't get a system large enough, it can cool down too quickly. And so in one big demonstration project, we showed that we could get enough bang for your buck in terms of power output per well, and that, everyone always says, well, what if it fails in 20 years? And I was like, well, in 20 years, we'll have de-risked that. But right now, it's just been 1 year, but 1 year of completely flat, stellar production and output is a hugely de-risking thing for this tech. So that's what we were able to accomplish there, and we consider it to be the first true breakthrough in commercial viability for enhanced geothermal systems.
And you brought down your drilling costs over the course of that by a lot, by a very large number, 70%. how like, you know, to somebody like me, drilling is drilling. Like, how does it get 70% cheaper the second or third time you do it?
Yeah, so first and foremost, drilling time is probably the biggest element that goes into the drilling cost. It is incredibly, you know, if you go to visit one of our drilling sites, we have an incredibly sophisticated piece of equipment, a large drilling rig. We have photos of them everywhere. There's dozens of people out there working at any point in time. So each day you're out there is incredibly expensive, like on the order of $100,000 plus. And then there's a lot of equipment that goes into it as well. And so when we drilled our well, you know, oil and gas and geothermal drilling is quite a bit different. Geothermal drilling, we're in higher temperature rock. We're usually targeting granite because that's where it happens to be that most of the high temperature rock is. We're drilling larger holes, and there's 18 other things that make it different from oil and gas drilling. And so when we first started out, I mentioned this to you earlier, we weren't big enough to get the attention of the oil field service companies broadly. So we were just taking off-the-shelf oil and gas drilling tech and trying to shoehorn it into working in this process. And the problem is that you have these amazing innovations that have made drilling in oil and gas really efficient. Like the one I talk about a lot is the polycrystalline diamond cutter bit. So like over 100 years ago, Howard Hughes invented the tricone roller bit. And that made him the richest man in the world, and that technology dominated the oil and gas industry for about 100 years. And then right when I was starting my career a little over a decade ago, you saw the PDC bit leapfrog and become the predominant drilling bit for oil and gas, and that is rather than rolling bits that crush the rock, you have a fixed cutter bit where the tips of that bit are synthetic diamonds, because diamond is the hardest substance you can get, and that scrapes the rock away. And so that actually was one of the huge unlocks that opened up shale oil and gas. But all of those bits have been designed for soft rock because that's what oil and gas drills through. And we had to adapt it to work for hard rock. So the first time we drilled a horizontal well, it took us 75 days. It took us $13 million to drill that well because it took so long. In the horizontal section, we drilled 3,000 feet, and we broke 13 bits in the span of drilling that 3,000 feet. And a lot of innovation is not sexy. It's not always like you come up with a whiz-bang, like, it's not like Doc in Back to the Future where you trip in the bathroom and hit your head on the counter and the flux capacitor comes to you in a vision. A lot of times it's just breaking a lot of things and then running a really rigorous program to figure out why did it break, how do you make it better for next time, and how do you improve. And so there wasn't a lot of experience of people using PDC bits in granite before. And this is just one example. I can tell you through every component on the drilling rig where we've improved things. But we started working with the bit suppliers to say, all right, it broke here this time. Can we add some extra support here? Can we make the blades a little bit longer? Can we change where we put the cutters? And what we saw is actually by the time we were drilling our 10th well, we drilled an entire lateral section through solid granite, 5,000 feet, and we only broke one bit instead of 13. And that meant that we were drilling wells in 17 days instead of 75 days. And it was just a lot of new improvements from a bunch of different innovations, a lot of which was come up with by our team and its proprietary Fervo, a lot of which is partnership through great suppliers. And a lot of this is, you know, as somebody who used to be a drilling engineer in the oil and gas industry, it's sort of like you do the whole 25 years of the shale revolution, but we got that version of the textbook that the teachers get, where there's an answer key in the back, because there's a bunch of tools that have been developed for oil and gas drilling over the last 25 years since the first shale well was successful that weren't developed for the hole sizes and the rock type of geothermal, and we don't have to go invent those from scratch. We can just go to the service companies and say, we want one of those, but we want it in this size and work at this temperature. And so our pace of improvement has been tremendous. And so now we're drilling wells in under $4 million when we used to drill them at $13 million.
So you said the thermal level did not drop over the course of a year, which is big. But I think a lot of the questions I get when I talk about geothermal to people who are not familiar with it is they think, do you not sort of suck all the heat out of the ground at some point? Is heat a finite thing that you can deplete, or does it regenerate fast enough? Like, what's the story there? What's the balance there?
Yeah, heat does regenerate. If you waited for that heat to regenerate through rock, which rock is not a very good conductor of heat, you would have really, really low output wells. And so we don't really try to meet steady state in terms of the heat of the rock stays constant over time, because then we wouldn't have 3 megawatt wells, or our most recent well test was 10 megawatt wells. It'd be much, much lower than that. And so we think about this more in terms of how do you design a well program that can where each one of those wells lasts for 30 years or longer. And then what we have is an ability to, as we continue to innovate on the drilling side, we can drill deeper and deeper and deeper into the resource, so you get to where there's virtually an unlimited supply. And so the heat does replenish, not at a rate that's fast enough that it would be sort of like your economic optimum to do it. And so we drill these wells and space them out and try to access a body of rock that means that it can produce at the right temperature for about 30 years. And then the way we think about our long-term asset management is whenever you get a well that starts to, where it's cooled off the rock locally too much, you can decommission it and start producing from other wells that we drill. And so the way we kind of think about this is we like to design our projects so that the wells last for 30 years, but the assets last for centuries. And that's kind of the general idea of how we think about geothermal resource management.
Just out of curiosity, though, and maybe you don't even know this, maybe we should ask a geologist, but like, if you were just gonna, like, if you had tapped out the heat to the point that it was no longer economic, and you shut the well down, and you just waited for the heat to build back up, is that like 10 years, 100, 200, 1,000?
It's in rock conduction, it's probably, like, we got the geologist right here.
At least as long as you operate.
Yeah.
Probably 2 times that or something.
Yeah. So and the expert geologist says, I called on you, so you get a free pass. It says, so if we run it for 30 years, wait 50, 100 years, and the heat will recover. And actually, there's been concepts here where people have actually talked about, rotation farming, like people used to talk about in the
like your fields replenish, the soil replenished, kind of similar. To
and by the way, the general crux of this is that there's so much heat in the earth, and that heat is also continually regenerating. The reason geothermal is considered a renewable energy resource is that heat supply is almost inexhaustible. And I've gotten into debates with people about this in the past, where and there was a good analysis that a geologist did, and they published it in a Wired article a couple of years ago that I always point them to, where I hear people say, well, the heat depletes locally, so it's not really renewable. There's only so much heat in the earth, and so you do the math on it, and if you were to take 2024 global human energy consumption and then divide it over the amount of heat in the earth, what you get is that we only have about 17 billion years worth of heat in the earth. And so my response is, okay, fine, it's not renewable, because in the ultimate heat death of the universe, nothing makes it. But most estimates for the sun is that it'll only last for 5 billion more years. So, we're 3 times longer than solar energy.
All right, so you built this test plant for Google. I don't even know if we should call it a test plant. Like, it's pretty big. It's not like a little. It's not a pilot.
Yeah, it's a real plant.
But now you are building a commercial. No more demonstration. You're out building a commercial power plant called Cape Station in Utah. So tell us how big that is, and how long is your list of off-takers? How big could you get it before you exhaust your off-takers?
So how big is it? What we've publicly announced so far through the first 2 phases is 400 megawatts. And we started drilling this project in 2023. And so just some scale, right? We're going from 3 megawatts to 400 megawatts in one jump. If y'all are energy entrepreneurs, almost always, like, I'd say a lot of my board meetings and a lot of people's board meetings are always the question of how big do you do this time and how big do you go for the next one? Right. Everybody has really strong rules of thumb about, don't do more than a 10x scale up or something like that. But I'll tell you the really nice thing about the scalability of geothermal is, even though our first project was only 3 megawatts, it was 2 wells, an injection well and a production well.
Yeah, it's modular, so it's not like you're building a giant well.
Yeah.
You're just doing well.
Exactly. And so that's what gave us conviction that we could go way bigger for project 2. because it's just a repetition. You know, other times when you scale up a plant, you have all sorts of scaling factor issues. Okay, if this is 10 times bigger, are my pressure and volume ratios going to get off, and all sorts of other questions. And with our case, the fact that we're just repeating that base unit of 2 wells over and over again, you don't have those scale-up issues. We were willing to jump in with both feet and say we're doing a 400 megawatt project. Now,
How many wells is 400 megawatts?
It'll be about 80 wells.
8 wells.
80. And in part because, and we've announced this in our first flow test results that we did in our Utah site, we've actually tripled the power output per well compared to our pilot project, because we've gone deeper, hotter, longer laterals. So our pilot project was at 350 degrees Fahrenheit. We're going to 420 degrees Fahrenheit now. Our pilot project was 3,000-foot laterals. We're doing 5,000-foot laterals now. And there's other changes we made, but we've basically been able to take it to where rather than getting 3 megawatts out of a production well, we get 10 now. So the wells are more productive. And so we're going to do 80 total wells. We've already drilled 20 of them. So we're well along our way here. We're going to put the first megawatts on the grid in 2026 from this project, 100 megawatts in 2026, 300 megawatts in 2028. We started power plant construction there. In October, the Biden administration announced that we'd gotten our final NEPA federal permitting action to expand the site all the way up to 2 gigawatts. So I told you earlier, we've only announced 400 megawatts publicly. The 2 gigawatts thing may give you a clue of how we're thinking about expanding that asset.
One other question about the replicability. How many power plants, turbines, per well? Or how many wells per power plant, I guess, would be the right way?
So because we're doing directional drilling, we can put a bunch of wells on one pad. So, and what we found is the most economic way to do this, to actually eliminate pipeline cost and reduce the footprint of the power plant, is build 1 power plant per well pad. And so for phase 1, we're doing a little bit smaller wells. That's what we're on right now. We have 3 well pads of 8 wells each, and 3 33-megawatt turbines that sits on each well pad. And we're generating roughly 100 megawatts of power when we commission that plant. Then we're actually going to even longer laterals and even bigger wells for phase 2, and we're going up to 10 wells a pad. And so we're going to do 50 megawatt turbines for phase 2. And to get back to this point on modularity, I think you did a great podcast a couple years ago about learning curves, which I think is the most important possible concept in technology innovation. I don't mean technology innovation like what software people do. I mean technology innovation
real
like what we do. is learning curves, which you can get a learning curve if you can drive standardization and modularity from unit to unit. Our team did a huge amount of analysis, and we now call these geoblocks because we've worked with our turbine suppliers to give us a standard 50 megawatt turbine generator combo that matches exactly with our 1 well pad output, and we put 1 per well pad. And the idea is that rather than try to get infinite economies of scale by making the turbines bigger forever, we actually get the right balance between shorter iteration cycles for improvement while not sacrificing too much on economies of scale by specifically choosing to do a 50 megawatt power unit. So when we do the phase 2 of this, 300 megawatts, we're going to do 6 power blocks over and over and over again and turn it into something that's a lot more of a mass manufacturing type approach that allows you to unlock these learning curves that rely on standardization and short cycle times.
Right. And is there, in terms of depth that you can get to with your current technology, and in terms of lateral feet, is there some limit? Like you've pushed it out a ways now. Can you push it out further and further? Like how far lateral can you go before you get lost out there?
A lot farther. We'll find out. We've gone from 3,000 to 5,000 just in the span of the last 2 years. We're going to do 7,500 later this year. To give you some context, the horizontal wells that the oil and gas industry is drilling now, you know, back when I left the oil and gas industry in 2015, we thought it was like the coolest thing that we could do a 5,000-foot lateral. And you talk to people now, and the records are 20, 25,000 feet, 30,000-foot laterals.
In fracking?
Yeah. And here's a crazy thing for you if you haven't followed the technology space. Where the oil and gas industry's found the limit isn't from a technical limit, but it's because landowners typically don't own land that extends 6 miles across.
Right.
And so, but you get so much efficiencies from having a longer lateral. No joke, what a lot of the oil and gas industry and drillers are pioneering right now is what they call horseshoe wells, where they're literally drilled down 5,000 feet in one direction, do a U-turn, and come back 5,000 feet in the other direction. And that's because sometimes they can't put enough landowners together to drill longer. So the technical limits aren't there. For us, we're having to go through this iteration cycle of learning how to drill in granite and learning how to drill at 450 degrees Fahrenheit, which is a different beast from what the oil and gas industry does. But we think we've developed the right technology tools to go to 7,500 feet now, and we're planning on expanding that to 10 to 15,000 feet in the next 2 to 3 years.
Could you horseshoe? Because I remember when I was looking at the geothermal company Ever, which is doing a closed loop thing, which their water circulates just through pipes rather than loose underground. But they were talking about drilling the pipe down and then having laterals kind of going off like a tree kind of thing. Like, is there any reason you couldn't do a lateral out and horseshoe back and another lateral? I mean, is there a limit to the number of laterals?
No, I'd say what we're doing now is because it's economic and it works.
Right.
And so no need to kind of push the technical boundaries when we already have something. I'm also a big believer in, people call the concept deployment-led innovation or learning by doing. When you look at the hard tech companies that have really done transformational things over the span of a couple decades, you never, ever, ever find a company that said, we're going to work on a 20 or 30-year moonshot, and it's going to be all science and R&D for 20 and 30 years, and then we're going to flip a switch and it works. What you find is a company that figures out how to improve and make money every step of the process, because you got to have some flywheel to fund the process. So SpaceX didn't start out with Starlink, and they didn't start out with the gigantic Starship rocket they're going now. They figured out, how do you make smaller ones and start with more traditional commercial satellites, and then how do you scale up to make larger rockets there? And so the answer to your question is, we're looking at all of those things, and no telling what 10 or 20 years of dedicated geothermal drilling innovation will do to these. But we have a system that works right now, and we're stepping our way into that. And I'll tell you one other big difference from oil and gas to geothermal that actually opens up a whole new wave of innovation possibilities is, oil and gas is always limited in the fact that they have to find hydrocarbon-bearing zones to develop their projects. And so, you wouldn't do crazy well geometries. Or sometimes people say, well, if you could drill that deep, wouldn't the oil and gas industry have done it by now? Well, if there's not oil deeper, you don't have an economic incentive to do it. And the oil and gas industry is not in the industry to do strange sciencey things.
To show off their...
And geothermal is far different. So when I was drilling in South Texas, the Eagle Ford Shale, a lot of times you only have a pay package there that's 300 feet thick. So nobody's asking the question, how do you go to 15,000 feet or 20,000 feet or something like that? But geothermal is quite a bit different, because generally, the deeper you go, the hotter it gets. And so when we think about what does the industry look like 10 years from now or 20 years from now, we want to drill yesterday's wells at 350 degrees Fahrenheit and 8,000 feet. Today's wells are at 400 degrees and 9,000 feet. The wells we're drilling next year are 450 degrees and 11,000 feet. And the fascinating thing is, because we're not chasing a hydrocarbon package, the fact that we're just chasing heat means that if we improve the technology so we can drill hotter and deeper, it improves our economics. So it's an industry that has a totally different technology curve than oil and gas, because there's actually a technology and financial incentive to figure out how to go deeper. And that's not something that generally the oil and gas industry has had. So I think when you think about what our industry will look like over a 20 or 30-year period, everything you just said about multilaterals or crazy loops or wild designs is in the cards, because it actually doesn't follow the same constraints as oil and gas drilling.
So if you're going to identify, say, the three big trends that are going to bring costs down for Fervo going forward: deeper, farther lateral, what else? Are those the main things?
No, deeper matters a lot, because if you can go from 400 degrees Fahrenheit to 450 degrees Fahrenheit, you can actually improve your power output by 30%.
Yeah, you
get
exponential.
It gets exponentially better. So that'll be a huge thing. We're going to continue to drive drilling costs down. What's fascinating, if you were to take the in-rel CapEx stack for an enhanced geothermal system project from 2 or 3 years ago, before Fervo published our results, what they would have told you is the power plant would have cost you $3,000 a kilowatt, and the drilling would have cost you $30,000 a kilowatt. And so all of the R&D focus was on driving down the drilling costs. And $3,000 a kilowatt is pretty expensive for a power plant, but when it's just like the tail wagging the dog, like there wasn't a lot of R&D focus on it. What we've done now from Fervo's standpoint on drilling innovation, keep in mind just in the last 2 years, I told you we've tripled the productivity of our wells by dropping the cost by 70%. We've dropped our subsurface costs by an order of magnitude. And so now we're talking about sub $3,000 a kilowatt subsurface costs, actually getting close to sub $2,000 a kilowatt subsurface costs. And so all of a sudden, there's been decades of focus on the drilling side of this equation. And in the span of about 2 years, we've taken the drilling part of the equation from being the prohibitively expensive part to the cheaper part of the operation. So you look at our engineering team, you can tell what we were focused on because 3 years ago, I think Quinn is here somewhere. Is Quinn here from our team? He may have stepped out, but Quinn was the entirety of our power plant engineering team, a team of one, because it just wasn't a primary focus of ours, and we probably had 20 times as many people on subsurface technical challenges. We now have more engineers on the power plant side focusing on cost-saving opportunities than we do on the subsurface side, because all of a sudden it's the bigger part of the cap stack.
Let me ask about that, because if there's one thing that seems like it's been standardized over time, it's a steam turbine. Like, what is there something unique about geothermal? Is there something unique about these steam turbines that is bespoke to geothermal?
So there's some geothermal that uses steam turbines, particularly the really high temperature resources if you're in one of the conventional, New Zealand or Northern California plays. But almost all of the growth in the US geothermal market over the last 10 or 20 years has been in organic Rankine cycle turbines, which isn't a new tech. Right. It's also, Rankine was in the 1800s, I think. So it's not like it's new, but it's only just now finding like mass market adoption. And the key is you can get higher efficiencies at lower temperature. And so up until ORC units got rolled out, the cutoff for your minimum viable temperature for geothermal might have been 500F or 550F or something like that, because it just wasn't efficient enough to run a steam turbine there. So we do organic Rankine cycle systems. And even though there's been hundreds of gigawatts or thousands of gigawatts of steam turbines built over the years, collectively, there's only been 4,000 megawatts total of organic Rankine cycle turbines. So it's still a technology that's not that far down its learning curve. And so you think about the one project we're doing in Utah right now is going to be 10% of the global market for ORCs just in one project. And if you look at Fervo's growth targets, we're going to get there very, very quickly. And so there's different technology innovation tools. We're pretty wedded to using organic Rankine cycle turbines. I'll tell you one of the keys for this.
Even if you're deeper and getting hotter?
Yes, and I can tell you the reason. There's two reasons for it. One is financial. Geothermal brine can have different things in it. And exposing your steam turbine and all of your equipment at the surface to that geothermal brine can lead to crazy corrosion and scale issues. I'd say the second thing is it is important to Fervo as a company, and I think the geothermal industry, to be zero emission. And a steam turbine is not necessarily zero emission, because if there's CO2 or other things in the geothermal brine, it can actually lead to emissions. And I'm a little tired of the industry having to explain, like, we're a tiny enough industry as it is, and having to explain different stories to different. It's probably confusing whenever you start talking to it, because is it low emission or no emission? Do we use some water or no water? There's just all these questions. And if you use a air-cooled system that is organic Rankine cycle, because all we do with the geothermal brine, bring it up, we run it through a heat exchanger, we pump it back down. It's a no emission technology. And I think as we scale, it's going to be more and more important over time to be no emission, not just low emission. And standardizing and driving innovation on a closed loop organic Rankine cycle system with air cooling is a way where you can go and put those power plants anywhere in the world, not worry about the emissions, not worry about the water, and just go. And so we think it's a superior technology. And Fervo is all in on that, because I think the standardization benefits and the environmental benefits of this type of power generation outweigh any potential upsides from using different technology.
And there's lots of innovation headroom still.
There's a lot of innovation headroom.
So before we get beyond the technical stuff, depth. Let's talk about drilling deeply. We just visited, some Canary folks and I, earlier today, Quaise, the company Quaise, which is trying to go deep by using millimeter waves. I always want to say lasers. I wish it were lasers. Millimeter waves to literally melt rock. We watched them melt rock in front of us. It's quite mind-blowing. So that's one area of innovation for getting deeper. How are you going to get deeper and deeper?
Yeah, it's a good question. We're excited to follow Quase's journey. I should say, we at the end of the day are a developer that uses technology to further our progress. And so nothing would thrill me more than to see Quase have a breakthrough in technology, and we would immediately be a huge customer of theirs. We think for the next 5 to 10 years, while there's other alternative technologies that are trying to kind of scale up to get to higher levels on the technology readiness level, you talk about innovation headroom. I think there's been so little drilling with modern rigs and automation with PDC bits in a granite environment that what we've done by cutting our drilling times by 70% in the last 18 months is not close to scraping the bottom of the barrel here. And you know what we've done now is we consistently are drilling faster than 100 feet per hour. We consistently are having bit lives where we can drill for 2,000 feet, 3,000 feet or longer. And I think we're going to get to a point relatively soon here where we're at 200 feet per hour, 10,000 foot bit life. And when you start hitting those kinds of numbers, going to 15,000 feet or 20,000 feet, which is kind of in our medium-term plan, is imminently doable. And by the way, if you can get down to 20,000 feet, there's enough geothermal resource to power the United States many, many times over. And so we're already in an area where the innovations we've gone that have allowed us to increase the depths of our wells by a few thousand feet just in the span of the 3 years we've been drilling aren't slowing down anytime soon, and we think we're going to be unlocking a market that is ubiquitous in terms of geothermal power generation relatively soon, just on the trajectory we're on right now.
Got it. Okay, so let's talk about applications, although I guess in our current context, power demand is so crazy and rising so fast. What to do with your energy is probably not high on your list of worries, but it seems like data centers are everywhere. Data centers are on everyone's mind. You know, this is a vexing thing for the clean energy folks because these data centers need enormous amounts of always-on, steady power, which is very challenging with existing zero-carbon technologies, although, you know, there's white papers out there on how to do this with solar and storage, mini grids. But it's a vexing problem, and this seems to fit hand in glove with those needs. So do you have data centers knocking down your door already? Are they on their way to Utah to build next to you? What's your relationship right now with data centers?
Yes. Well, data centers and sort of the leadership in the tech industry is one of the key things that got Fervo started. You know, we already mentioned the partner for us on that very first project we did was Google. And it was because Google, even going back into 2018, launched this 24/7 carbon-free energy initiative, which was focused on total decarbonization of their electricity supply and recognition that even though they're one of the largest buyers of wind and solar in the world, that they needed to complement that with emerging technologies to get all the way to 24/7. And we've been excited to expand that partnership. In the summer of 2024, we announced what we call the Clean Transition Tariff, which is a multi-party agreement between Fervo, Google, and Envy Energy so that we can develop and sell Google 115 megawatts of power through a new project that we're going to be developing in Nevada as part of that continued partnership. So it's definitely happening. The renaissance, it's cool to be in power again. That's the thing. and when kind of we started this company, actually the number one reason VCs passed on Fervo back in the early days was they just didn't think anybody would want the power, which is quaint to think about it today. But the idea is that, you know, you think about 2020, there'd basically been flat power demand growth in the United States for 2 decades.
Which means you add something, you take something else off.
Yeah.
Which is a fundamentally different situation than we're in now.
It was a zero-sum game. You were also looking at a situation where solar had gotten really cheap, and I think people were just basking in the glow of the success that solar was cheap. And natural gas had gotten really cheap, and I think people were basking in the glow of the success that natural gas had gotten really cheap. And you weren't seeing these ambitious 100% renewable energy targets or 24/7 carbon-free energy targets. So it's kind of like, nobody's going to want the power. You fast forward today, it could not be a different market in the power world. You have many jurisdictions and many companies that have actually committed to not a 10% or a 20% renewable portfolio standard, but 100%. You have things like, we're here in Texas, obviously. Like, I think, like most of y'all, I lost power for a week during Winter Storm Uri, and that was not fun. One of the big things for our business is in August of 2020, the state of California had its first rolling blackouts since the old Enron energy crisis 2 decades before, and that spurred the California Public Utility Commission into action to think about how do we round out capacity for reliability, and they took a procurement mandate that included geothermal. And so we were already seeing new demand signals. And then late in 2023, ChatGPT goes viral, and everything about the world got turned upside down. And now all of a sudden, there's sort of now 3 phases in the American electricity grid: the 100 years where it was growing exponentially, the 20 years where it was completely flat, and now we're back on the exponential curve again. And the relationship, we think a lot of our business is going to be driven in the near term by this data center demand. And I can tell you the way these conversations have gone is, 5 years ago, we'd talk to somebody and they wanted 20 megawatts of power somewhere, and they didn't really care what it was, and you talk to them about siting, and they were like, well, we need to go where the fiber's good. We need to go where there's a workforce. We need to go where you have access to water for cooling. Utah doesn't check the box, so like, have a nice life. And that was the answer we got, because energy access was probably one of 15 different criteria for siting a data center. And now all of those customers are coming back and say, hey, we'll come to you. Can you do a gigawatt for us now, not just 20 megawatts? And what you've seen is the market has shifted enough where energy access, I think, went from being, middle of a list of 15 priorities for data center siting to probably number 1. And I've asked some of our folks, like, well, you told us it was a non-starter 2 years ago, and here we are. And it's like, okay, it turns out all the other problems are solvable, and energy access to new energy, reliable energy, is sort of the gating factor there. And so, you ask 10 people, you'll get 11 different opinions on how much power demand AI is going to drive over the next 5 to 10 years. The answer is it's positive, it's large, it's huge, and it's a totally different set of customers and strain on growth of the U.S. electric grid than anything we've ever experienced before.
Yeah, and I'll just throw in here, adding, within 10 years, we're going to be well into electrifying transportation world over, electrifying buildings, heating and cooling world over, electrifying industry world over. So the rise in energy and electricity demand, there's in no danger of being any kind of blip or short-term fad. That's the rest of our lives.
And I will say, I'm glad you pointed that out, because I do think AI is the shiny object. So that's what gets all the attention. But let's not forget, even before the ChatGPT moment, demand forecasts were rising again, because we're onshoring manufacturing, we're electrifying buildings, EVs are coming onto the grid, there's new economic development, and really what you had is a system that was used to growing like this, where, like you said, 1 in, 1 out, that's it. People, it's not the employees, the supply chains, nobody was set up to bend like this. We were already bending like this, and then we had a new, from those things, industrialization, clean energy, onshoring manufacturing, electric vehicles, and then you had one more thing to it. And that was the thing that really got people to realize it's a totally different era.
So before I leave the data center thing, they want a gigawatt from you. So you've got this 8-well pad that is producing how much, you said? 50?
That's 30 megawatts now.
30 megawatts.
And we're working on a 10-well pad that does.
Yeah, so I'm trying to help us envision what a gigawatt of your geothermal looks like. That's a big chunk of Utah desert, is it not?
Yeah. So yes and no. Is it a sizable industrial complex? Yes. Is it a smaller footprint than any other way you're going to get that level of energy from a surface disturbance standpoint? Yes. And so if you come out to our site, and by the way, happy to take you out to our site anytime. It's a fun thing. What we have is these 8-well pads that we stack up, one, and then we put another one a little bit to the north and another one a little bit to the north, and we build the turbine generators right off the pads. And so we basically just have a line of pads that you can stand and look at, and collectively, just to give you some sense of scale, that 400 megawatts is, when we bring it online, and when we bring in the last phase online in 2028, will be over 10% of Utah's power generation. Oh. And we're going to be able to do that within a few square mile area at one spot in the center of the state. So is it big? Yes. is it big relative to the power output and economic value that it brings to the grid? No, and I think that's one of the other features that's very powerful about geothermal is it's compact from a land use standpoint.
Certainly more so than solar, but not as much as nuclear, right? I mean, nuclear has a problem of being mostly imaginary, but if it were real, it would be. If it were real, it would be smaller, right?
It is difficult to compare our actual project results to imaginary project results, but to be a little less flippant about it, nuclear is also a very energy-dense area. I think there's a renaissance going on in nuclear right now, which I think is very encouraging for the country too. I think when you look at things like the security and standoff requirements of nuclear plants and and the footprint of mining that goes into it and other factors, it's not too dissimilar. I'm sure that an endless number of academics have published endless numbers of papers on these that show directionally, I'd say they're in the same ballpark. They're better than a lot of other energy resources. If somebody wants to really duke it out with me and fight that nuclear is slightly more land compact, like, I'll concede. Okay. But we're both have attributes that are very attractive from an environmental impact standpoint.
Right. So practically speaking, in the short term, the competition to power data centers, your competitor is natural gas. Like, I think, like, if you were a cynic, right? You're watching a lot of big companies with a lot of very lofty clean energy goals run up against the limits, and you wonder, well, which is going to give, the hunger for more data centers or the clean energy target? And, you know, I'm guessing the clean energy target. And gas is cheap. It's right there. It's, you know, it's right at hand. It's easy to build. Utilities know it. Lawmakers love it, et cetera, et cetera. So maybe just like flatly, like, how do your current costs of your current Utah plant compare to natural gas?
Yeah, it's difficult to compare directly to natural gas for a couple reasons. One is we don't have fuel cost. Right. So you have to take a view on what are the long-term prices of natural gas there. And you also have we have different regulatory risks and exposures and things like that. I can tell you right now, we are generally at a point, and I'm happy to discuss the specific CapEx numbers because we actually published this in our technology day that we hosted here in Houston in September. We are building these projects at around $6,000 a kilowatt right now, which on a CapEx basis is significantly more expensive than what you get from a new combined cycle gas plant. Although I'll say our costs are going in different directions because we're dropping our costs down pretty dramatically. What you're seeing is the supply chain for natural gas power generation isn't used to a huge call on demand like this as well. And so you're actually seeing costs go in the opposite direction for there. So the gap is just closing naturally. But we also on that tech day published where we think our costs are going, which is at the span of 2 or 3 projects, we think we can drop costs below $3,000 a kilowatt. And I think we're going to do that for the reasons I talked about. Standardize the power plant, move into a mass manufacturing mentality, dropping drilling costs and drilling hotter wells. And at $3,000 a kilowatt, you can remove all the subsidies, you can remove all the other things that tip the different scales, and just on a CapEx basis, and you take the fact that geothermal doesn't have fuel cost, and I think we've got a better cost than natural gas. And that's even absent any environmental attributes or any rec factors in, and we're not there today. What we do is that we offer a valuable enough product that our offtake prices, we still make an attractive financial return, which is why we've been able to raise capital and we can find customers who want this. But our vision for geothermal is by 2030, drop that cost to sub $3,000 a kilowatt. And the thing that we think about the energy transition and driving sustainability is you have to offer an end product that is irresistible to your buyer, regardless of the whims of their climate commitments that they may or may not be sticking to. And I think we're on a path to be there in geothermal within the next 5 years.
All right, so I'll just repeat that to put a fine point on it. You think you have a line of sight to being cost competitive with natural gas, absent subsidies, absent carbon prices, absent anything else. Pretty cool. So a lot of people don't know this, but there was a national election recently, and things changed a bit.
I need to get my beer for this.
I know. So I think for wind and solar, you know, for dim-colored energy, this is obviously dire. No one knows how dire or exactly what kind of dire. No one knows anything yet. But it was, as I was thinking about this, like, you seem like, you know, maybe alone among all of Americans. You seem like you're really well positioned. Like, this could actually be quite good for you, because I think there's still going to be some impetus for decarbonization. There's still going to be some, and I don't think administrations or state governments are going to want to look like they're just shutting the whole thing down, right? So they're going to favor the non-renewable, clean things, you know, which involves a lot of nonsense, a lot of CCS, a lot of hydrogen, but it also involves geothermal. So I would just wonder, like, and you know, the first time I talked to you, I remember years ago, you were like, our problem is not that anyone hates us, it's that no one knows we exist, right? It's that no one knows about us. Now people know about you. As far as I can tell, still no one hates you. Do you feel like you're, like this, the new political landscape is advantageous to you, or?
Yeah, in fact, when I told you that years ago, I probably used the same joke that I now use like every time I talk. So I apologize to anybody in the room who's ever heard me talk before. But the thing we find with geothermal is it used to be bipartisan in DC in the sense that neither party knew what it was. And we have, I think, fairly deftly navigated through multiple different administrations, through a huge shift in energy policy priorities, becoming both known and bipartisan. And there's concrete examples of that. You know, one of my favorite, if you look at the new Senate, the chair of the Senate—
Do I have to?
Yes, you have to. The chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee is Senator Mike Lee from Utah. A very proud and principled conservative that will tell you that, that he is probably one of the most outspoken people in the Senate in terms of his diehard conservative principles. The ranking member is Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, who is very proud of his progressive bona fides and is proud to tell everybody that. You look at where is there common ground for those two people to overlap between the ranking member and the chair of the Senate Energy and Natural Committee and Energy and Natural Resources Committee. I can tell you where it is: sponsorship of the GEO Act that they both co-sponsored in 2024 to drive more incentives and streamline permitting for geothermal. And so what we find is that there's a lot to like on both sides of the aisle for what geothermal can provide. It's carbon-free energy that employs people from the oil and gas workforce. So it's a just transition workforce story, which is fantastic. It's a climate change story, which is fantastic. You know what else it is? It uses uniquely American innovation. Domestic
extremely
content.
American energy.
The drilling sector, which is really exciting. And it's baseload, you know, which is the thing that a lot of, you know, has become. I think somebody did a quote looking at Secretary Burgum's confirmation hearing, and I think there was like 100 mentions of the word baseload because that's what people are thinking about right now. How do you get that reliability? So we find that bipartisan line, and we think it's an area that we will make significant progress in energy access and climate over the next 4 years, and where there may not be that many other opportunities for compromise between the Democratic leadership and the Trump administration. And to kind of drive this point home on a little bit more of a personal level, you know, soon-to-be Secretary Chris Wright, who just got voted out of the Senate E&R committee 15-5, several Democrat votes, so he has bipartisan support, invested in Fervo through his company Liberty Energy in 2022 and has been a board observer of ours. And so I know a lot of folks on the Democrat side are very antsy about him because he's outspoken on his views on climate. But in his whole hearing, he was unabashed that he's very excited about geothermal and moving forward. So I certainly see this is going to be one of those areas where we're going to have bipartisan support through the next 4 years to make significant progress on climate and energy access, yeah, I hope to keep it that way.
What happened to the GEO Act? What's the status?
The GEO Act got taken wholesale into EPRA, so that was exciting. It got very close to passing, and then when EPRA fell apart at the end of the last Congress, went back to the drawing board. But there's many provisions in there that fix some long-standing redundancies of geothermal permitting that would really accelerate project development. And we, if there is an opening for a bipartisan compromise on permit reform in 2025, I think geothermal will be included in it. We were a little sad to see that the big compromise bill fell apart right at the end of the last Congress, because I actually don't know if we're going to get a window for a bipartisan compromise on permitting ever again.
Yeah.
So we'll see what happens.
But that's not a must-have for you. That's a you'd like to have it.
We have certainly managed to get projects through the federal permitting process already. I mentioned earlier our project in Utah is already permitted to expand up to 2 gigawatts. It took us about 3 years to go through the federal permitting process on that, so not as fast as it could be, but not something that is an absolute project killer. The other thing where I think there's alignment both on the outgoing Biden administration and the incoming Trump administration is there's a lot of things that can be done administratively to streamline permitting. And one of the final actions of the outgoing Biden administration was actually pushing through administrative categorical exclusions for geothermal permitting that don't require new laws to be passed, because that was a priority. Developing clean American energy on federal lands was a priority of the Biden administration. And so that was one of the final acts that's actually already made a huge difference in our business. And we do not expect the Trump administration to be any more we don't expect them to be bashful on trying to push further permit reforms. So I don't think that progress is going to be walked back.
Got it. So coming close to wrapping up, I sort of think about your experience. So like you came out of the oil and gas industry and started this thing. So you have been a dude with a pitch deck and a gleam in his eye.
That's all it was in the beginning?
You've been a technology developer, innovator. You've been a first of a kinder. now you've been a pilot plant. Now you're moving into, a commercial enterprise. Just like, how is your head still on straight? This is like it's wild how rapidly you've accelerated through all these phases, and it seems to be like the plane seems to be holding together, and you seem to have your zen about you. Like, what's your secret, Tim? How do you?
Thank you. Every day isn't that zen, but we make it through. It is fascinating. I'll tell you a couple things that I'm proud of in terms of the culture that's been created at Fervo. One thing we repeat all the time, that I think is an important thing to think about from a personal growth standpoint and a company growth standpoint is I'll say this phrase a lot, and it's caught hold in our company, that our goals are so ambitious and we're growing so fast that we have to be willing to totally reinvent ourselves on a quarterly basis if we want to succeed, because it is true. The things that it takes to go from pitch deck to pilot are different skills than going from pilot to developer. And I can be concrete about this. When you fund a really early stage, like pre-seed company, what you're looking for is a market size so massive and a technology leap so huge that the naive entrepreneurs sending you the pitch deck can be wrong about 9 out of the 10 things that they tell you, but as long as they're right about one thing, you still have a business. And that's kind of the idea. And that whole move fast and break things and try stuff is shoot for something so big when you're early stage, celebrate failure, move forward with that. And you have to embrace that in your DNA as an early company. I see some of my friends in the room who are project developers here. Project development, you could not imagine a more polar opposite organizational.
You do not want to break things in
project
project development.
And I'll also tell you, it's totally inverse. If you're wrong out of 9 and 10 things in a startup, but you're really right about that one thing, like, you got a business. If you're right about 9 out of 10 things as a developer, but you forgot a permit, or you didn't have the right contract provisions in your insurance agreement, or you didn't get your interconnection in queue in time, or like, oh, oops, transformers take 5 years to come around, or you didn't get the right labor agreement put in place. Guess what? You don't get an A for getting 9 out of 10 things right. That's a 0. And project development is completely unforgiving. And I think what we have at Fervo, I have some of my colleagues are here in the room, and it's just the team that I think has been really taking that mentality of personal growth and continuous growth to heart, that it's a lot of the same people who had that wild-eyed, like, let's move fast and break things and let's shoot for the moon. And as we've learned, we've been beaten slowly into being developers where we don't want to make any mistakes. But if you want to be successful in scaling a company, you got to be willing to go kind of on that journey. And everything's about the people, right? And what we've done is we've been incredibly lucky that every step of the way in Fervo's journey, we've been able to get kind of the best of the best talent to join. I don't know, I feel shameless doing a plug, but we have 20 open positions on the fervoenergy.com careers page right now. So if you think you're the best and you want to join, please think about joining our team. But the reason I stay sane is because we've got a team that has taken the challenge of growing themselves with the company seriously.
Excellent. Well, we have time for a few questions, and I bet people have them. Over there.
Well, thanks to both of you for a great discussion and hearing some things in following this area we haven't heard before. I talked to a couple of your colleagues at the break, and I didn't swab them too hard, but I'll swab you. You talked about scalability. In your blue sky view, to the degree that you're comfortable talking about it, Tim, how do we downscale? Because people are talking about small nuclear reactors that, if everything goes right, are going to take 10 years between permitting and execution. You can fill a pad and drill it out in a year or two. Both direct use and smaller scale electric generation, again, to the degree you're comfortable talking about it. Where do you see the future for that, both in North America and elsewhere? Because we know where the Great Basin is in East Africa and Iceland and Java, Sumatra, and that's going to limit us. But there's a big world out there where heat is going from the mantle to the surface, and we can capture that. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think I heard, how do we scale beyond these hot spots, and also how do we maybe do smaller projects to tackle different market
what's
things?
Kind of smallest viable, like is distributed at all? What's the smallest viable project size?
A doublet, yeah. So 10 megawatts is probably, 5 or 10 megawatts is probably as small as we'd go. I could say what we've learned through doing these projects is our projects do benefit for economies of scale. There's a reason why we're pushing for multi-100 megawatt projects. And so that's what we're pushing on right now. I can tell you that we are looking to go smaller, and to go smaller, you have to get more value for it, right? Because no one wants to pay more for electricity unless you're getting something there. So when we look to go smaller, that is because, are we looking for a direct heat business that may have a different load? And clean heat is incredibly valuable. And as proud as we are about the conversion efficiencies going from heat to power that we have on our sites, you're still talking about low-grade heat that only has somewhere between a 15 to 20% conversion efficiency. So you can just keep it direct heat. There's a lot more you can do there. So we definitely see that going forward. Fervo is certainly not the only company in the space too. I mean, I think I've been really excited to see the ecosystem around geothermal grow up. I think Bedrock is a company that just announced a $12 million Series A. Just last week, and they're going after more building, heating, and cooling things. So I think there's things you can do to go smaller. It may not be what Fervo does right away, but there's other companies out there, and it's a big market. The moving beyond the basin and range and the East African Rift and things, it's just a function of drilling costs. If you can drill a 20,000-foot deep well tomorrow for the cost of a 10,000 feet deep well today, you can make that project in the money. And so that's why we're so relentlessly focused on dropping drilling costs, because ultimately we don't see any geology as being a place that's not developable. It's just how ambitious can we get on driving drilling costs down?
Cool. Over there.
Not tomorrow, but soon.
Iowa specifically. All right, over here.
Yeah, so my question is, the comparison was made between geothermal and nuclear and natural gas, and it always is. But my question is a comparison question as well between kind of fervo geothermal versus traditional geothermal. And the way I think the way I'll ask a question is, if on your 8-well pad where you're generating 30 megawatts of power, if Joe Geothermal, the traditional geothermal guy, rocked up and drilled those, their typical 8 wells on that same location, what do you think they would have produced, or what would it have costed, or what, pick your metric. I'm just trying to draw a apples to apples comparison.
Yeah, I think that if you look at the well test results, well, number one, conventional geothermal technology probably wouldn't have gotten much of anything because it's so reliant on natural permeability. But if there were to be, like I mentioned this before, between Los Alamos and really when fervo started, there's been about 50 different EGS attempts, and the vast majority of them got 5 liters per second to 10 liters per second if they were successful, and many of the projects didn't even get to a flow test. And you compare that to 60 liters per second on our pilot project, and we got to 120 liters per second on our flow test there. So we're at least one order of magnitude more productive than what any prior enhanced geothermal systems attempted been. And that's why in 2025 we're talking about EGS, and it's not on the fringes anymore. You didn't really call on Cody, did you?
Oh, sorry, man. I got a technical question for you. So I know geothermal is lumped into baseload, which is so hot right now, but was not so hot just a year or two ago when solar was ascended, and we wanted everything to be very flexible, right? And still in some places, I expect flexibility will be the premium thing and not the baseload. So can you tell us, can you be flexible, and how much with geothermal? Is there a problem with depleting the well or having it, lose
Ooh, I love this
temperature?
question, I love this question, and I love the answer.
Yes, is the answer.
Specifically, yes.
So we actually have a technology that we've developed, and actually, I haven't mentioned it a lot, but we've gotten this wonderful partnership with the Department of Energy for the last 8 years since we started fervo. We expect it to continue under the new administration as well. And one of the things we got was an RPE grant to test the technology we call fervo flex. And actually, at that pilot in northern Nevada, I can tell you the last year of production, we just brought it on its base load because, as you can imagine, in an offtake agreement that's megawatt hour based, that's your incentive as a developer. But we know where the market's going, and we know baseload went from being the thing to being dead to now the phoenix rising from the ashes. But clearly, the electric grid of the future is going to be one that's driven by ever increasing levels of variability. So we do think that dispatchability attribute is going to continue to be important. And so what was interesting about fervo flex is we basically, through this RPE grant, we're able to test our well system in Nevada to operate in a storage and dispatchability mode. And I think one of the things that's interesting about the way we develop our systems is the fact that there's no permeability for the last 100 years has meant that you can't develop geothermal there, but because it's impermeable, actually gives us an interesting way to do energy storage, because the only permeability that ends up in the geothermal reservoir is the fractures that we create, and the surrounding area is actually impermeable. And so what that means is that we operated the mode in a flexible cycle where we shut in our injection well and shut in our production well and kept pumping down our injection well, and we mimicked specifically sort of 12-hour diurnal cycles of no production, flush production, no production, to sort of simulate a solar heavy grid of the future, and found that we got really great numbers on round trip efficiency. We were able to actually get much higher max peak output than our steady state operations through that energy storage.
So just to be clear, you're capping the output and you're still pumping water down, so just pressure. Yes. It's being the energy is being stored as pressure.
That's right. And so, I told you it's roughly a 3 megawatt project, right? And what you find is that the pumping of that can take up 500 kilowatts or 700 kilowatts. And so that sort of eats into your output in a normal time. But if you actually can run the system in a mode where you only pump, let's say, for example, during the daytime when there's a lot of solar, you take all of your parasitic load and you become a net energy consumer during the day, and you actually build up so much storage in the reservoir that it will self-flow even without any injection pumping during the evening. And so we sort of simulated that and showed that we could get really strong round-trip efficiencies day to night. Because base load is so hot right now, all of our current agreements, like people just want that power around the clock, and that's what's driving things. But when we start talking to our customers about 2030's project delivery, building these inherent energy storage capabilities into the geothermal reservoir is something that's driving increasing interest.
Is this something that's far enough along that you have any sense of your duration, just how far out you can push your duration?
So, yes. And anybody who wants to read more about this, you can look up. We co-authored a bunch of different papers with Jesse Jenkins and Wilson Ricks from Princeton's Zero Lab.
I did a pod with Wilson Ricks on this very question.
You can listen to the pod, which I think is in true Volts fashion, an hour-plus long deep dive. You can also read the papers, which I think there's 200-plus pages of how this works. It was a great thing because we looked at reservoir simulation results, and we asked the question of for grids at different levels of solar penetration, to simulate today's grid or a grid 5 years from now or 10 years from now or California versus the national grid, what was the optimum cycle time? We usually found a diurnal cycle time was best. And with the data, field data we've collected, for sure we can hit, an 8 or 12-hour storage time. We have not yet kind of pushed the limits on, can you do multi-100-hour energy storage? But
what would happen if you just capped it and kept pumping and pumping and pumping? Like, is something going to blow up or pop off or what?
Nothing's gonna blow up. It would be completely dependent on the reservoir. I say impermeable. Impermeable is not really a great. It's a meaningless word. Nothing is impermeable.
Right.
Things are just more or
right.
less permeable. And what you find is even as you pressure up, there's more and more fluid loss. And so there's all kinds of things that are reservoir dependent and system dependent that would shift performance and round trip efficiency. But we've done some tests where, for example, we'll pressure up wells and then we'll go off and do other operations on other wells and come back and a month after we've worked on the wells, there's still pressure in the system. And so it's completely formation and reservoir dependent, but it certainly has the opportunity to be a multi-day storage system.
Interesting. Well, that is all the time we got. I'm being told to wrap up, so thank you all so much for coming. Thank you, Tim, for all your work. Thanks for Fervo. Well, there's almost enough happening now that I could...
All right, thank you all for coming. That is the final conclusion of tonight's festivities. Y'all have been awesome. We love all the questions. I hope this was valuable, and thanks for supporting Canary Media and Greentown Labs, and tell your friends. Have a great night. Thank you.